Chapter 72, Antony Has a Mood, Antony's POV. When Antony came back to himself, he was guzzling from a bowl of blood. It wasn't a tidy affair. The thick liquid was sliding down his chin, his neck, his chest. It was getting in his loose hair and his nightshirt and the sheets! His cry of protest was really more of a bubbling moan. He was still drinking greedily. He wasn't sure if he could stop if he tried, and by moving his mouth, he only succeeded in making more of a mess. Just drink. It was Julia's voice, using the doctor tone that they all knew better than to argue with, and presumably her hand on his shoulder. Antony obeyed, draining the bowl and just barely stopping himself from licking the rough pottery when he was done. How had he gotten so hungry? "How do you feel?" Julia asked. Antony considered this and concluded that he felt like shit. His whole body ached, but especially his back, which was a blur of screaming pain that made his eyes water. Hunger still gnawed his belly. He was covered in drying blood that he'd been consuming with all the poise of a pig at a trough. Shame was slowly twisting through him as his mind cleared and he remembered everything that had happened. "I'm fine," he growled. "Theo knows. Fuck, she knows. She saw. Fuck. How?" He raised his eyes from the bowl and cast his gaze around the room. He was on his bed, and Julia seemed to be kneeling behind him, one steadying hand on his shoulder, and the other supporting the bowl. Otherwise, the bedroom was empty, just as it had been when Theodora had lugged him in like a sack of bloody laundry. "Hanyu!" It was a groan, a snarl, a sigh. Julia's fingers tightened on his shoulder. "Don't be too harsh on him." "He's safe?" "Yes, he's in Theo's rooms." Antony sagged in relief, but let his rising anger permeate his tone. "Good. As soon as I can stand, I've got to teach that reckless fool a lesson. That's not harshness, that's necessity. Trying to convince him to listen to me with words has clearly gotten us nowhere." "He was right to get help," Julia said, withdrawing her hand from his shoulder to take the bowl and set it aside. "You had lost so much blood that you would have entered a feeding frenzy before long. I suspect that's why our dear friend Marcus kept his attendant in the room, in fact." "That wasn't fair. Of course Marcus wouldn't do that. He just had too much faith in Antony's resilience and self-control as usual." "Your dose of elf blood was in that bowl as well," Julia went on. "It was almost time, anyway." That explained why his head felt so clear even though he was still ravenous. He glanced again at the bowl. "Whose blood?" "Several of Theo's squadrons made donations," Julia replied. Antony winced. Not only had she seen him bleeding and crawling, but he'd also gotten her beloved humans hurt. Surely she wouldn't have let old Joji give any. He was much too frail for that sort of blood loss. Scarcely less awful was the idea of Bunta opening a vein, glowering into the bowl as his blood splashed begrudgingly. Of course, most of the blood had probably come from Kenta, the youngest of them, and Antony flinched anew at the idea of the gentle worm boy with a bandage on his arm. Theo and Hanyu would both hate him for that. Hanyu! Just the thought of that open face and he was furious again. All of this was his fault. How dare the man come prying into Antony's personal business? Wasn't it bad enough that Hanyu had watched him humiliate himself in front of him and Asao? Why had he had to drag Theo and Julia and all our passel of humans into it as well? What gave him the right? Antony had been doing him a favor, protecting him from the consequences of his own boneheaded actions, and this was how he was repaid? Public mockery? He should have just done as Marcus wished and beat the man bloody, or locked him up for a month, or... His ire twisted into panic at even the barest hint of that train of thought. Hanyu, what a fucking nuisance. There had never been any other option besides protecting him. Antony would do it all over again right now, though he would curse the man's name the whole time. Julia was speaking again, and Antony forced himself to listen. "I could get you some more for the men in the barracks, but I thought you'd rather keep the matter private." At least somebody around here understood discretion. Maybe Julia could be his new best friend now that Theo loathed him. "My lords?" The sweet, tremulous voice was accompanied by an equally tremulous body as Asao shuffled through the door from the sitting room on his knees. He flinched down into his bow as their eyes turned to him, but went on speaking nonetheless. "Please forgive your servant's interruption, but it would be my honor to offer my unworthy blood," he said meekly. The offer sent a tender pang through Antony's chest. His sympathy sharpened into distress when he looked at the young man's bruised wrists and shaking, freshly bandaged hands. "No thank you, Esau," Antony said, trying to make his voice gentle. Julia was less worried about gentleness. "Absolutely not," she snapped. "If I had my way, I'd put you on bed rest for a week. The last thing you need is to lose more blood." Antony cut in, trying to soothe any sting her words might have caused. "But thank you. It's very generous of you to offer." At least, he hoped it was generosity rather than pity. "And sit up," Julia scolded, taking no notice of Antony's efforts to soften the tone of this conversation. "I told you to stay off your knees until I could get you some pads. Go back to the sofa." Esau backed away, shamefaced, and Julia shifted to sit next to Antony on his ruined bed, her face drawn tight with worry. "I don't like the look of his bruises," she confided in their own language. "Is Marcus going to be in trouble for your back and everything?" There it was. Antony had known this was coming. He shook his head and started mustering all his arguments. Instead of picking a fight, though, all she said was, "In that case, could you tell him to be more careful of Esau's neck and internal organs? He should know better than to strike him so erratically." Antony fumbled for a moment, caught wrong-footed that she hadn't tried to talk him into some kind of punishment for his lover. His voice, when he finally found it, was still tinged with directionless defensiveness. "I'll tell him you said so," he grumbled. In truth, he didn't know what he would say to Marcus the next time he saw him. Probably nothing, until he knew for sure that his lover wasn't going to demand that he flog Theo. "Thank you." She got to her feet. "Now, I'm going to fetch Hanyu. You should be stable enough to feed from him now," and he insisted. Antony was even more reluctant to see Hanyu than Marcus, but he couldn't leave his attendant in Theo's rooms indefinitely. Goodness knew she couldn't spare the space. "Fine," he grated out. "And could you find someone to ask about fresh bed sheets? These are ruined." "Completely," she agreed. "I'll be back soon." With her gone and Esau too cowed to leave the sofa in the other room, Antony finally had the chance to catalog his injuries, at least to an extent. Of course, he couldn't really gauge the severity of his wounds on his back, but Julia had wrapped his entire torso in bandages, so he assumed it wasn't anything pretty to look at. The thought drew his lips up into a smirk, and he looked again at his wrappings. Sure enough, they covered all his worst scars. Never mind, then. This was probably the prettiest he'd looked in centuries. He reached up a tentative hand and found another bandage on his forehead, but there was no sting when he pressed down. Perhaps the fresh infusion of blood had already cleared away the shallow cut there. Other small hurts were equally diminished. His broken left hand barely pained him anymore. Truly, elf blood was a marvel. Still, when he tried to stand, his legs gave one dispirited wobble and then folded. He flopped back on his bloody bed, wishing he still had the excuse of needing to catch his breath. His body would mend, it always did. His life, though, that was questionable. He didn't have any more time to question it, though, because the door crashed open in that way that could only mean one person. Honestly, what is his vendetta against doors? Sure enough, Hanyu barreled into the room, looking pale and tired, but reassuringly solid. "Antony!" he wailed, flying to the bedside with his arms open. "Hanyu!" Theo barked from the sitting room. "Don't touch his back!" Hanyu, who had clearly intended to grab Antony up in another airborne hug, instead dropped to his knees and clutched his legs. The embrace was bone-grindingly fierce, and there was also something fierce in the already tear-stained face the young man turned up to him. Antony, however, was distracted by his other visitor. Theodora hurried after Hanyu, then hesitated when she saw that he wasn't manhandling Antony's injuries. Her gaze flicked up to Antony's, then down again. Her shoulders hunched a little, tense in a way that told him that she was definitely still pissed, but she seemed to have deflated and seemed unlikely to make a scene. That was a mercy. He also noticed that her face was slightly swollen, and she had a hand curled protectively over her ribs. She was hurt. He wished he could pin all the blame for that on Hanyu, but of course the human hadn't had any way to make her run to his rescue. No, she was hurt because of him. Again. Apparently, it wasn't enough that Antony had gotten them all cursed and exiled. No, he just kept hurting anyone foolish enough to care for him, over and over again. "Julia said you needed more to eat," Theo said at last. "But I didn't figure you'd agree to feed from him without me." Her kindness made his throat prickle dangerously, but it also made him feel like a louse. Why now, when she'd seen for herself how he deserved to be treated? Please, please eat something, Hanyu coaxed from his place on the floor. You hadn't for almost 2 days, and then Lord Julius said you lost blood and... Oh, ew, you really did. Antony looked down at the young man, who was wrinkling his nose at the state of the sheets, and felt his gut twist in a strange combination of anger and fondness. Hanyu was a menace to himself, and Antony wanted nothing more than to gather him in his arms and keep him there, close and safe, forever. He couldn't do that, though. Not yet. Hanyu's recklessness over the previous hours had shown that Antony had not done his duty by this man. If he was going to make his wonderful, infuriating offering safe, the softness would have to wait. Thank you, Theodora, he said, raising his eyes to hers and trying not to pin too many hopes on the fact that she was here. Once that's done, would you be kind enough to escort Asao to the barracks? He wouldn't demand that she return to Marcus herself. Still, his supernatural hearing caught the young man's relieved sigh from all the way in the sitting room. Asao understood as well as Antony that it would be a simple matter for his master to retrieve him from there. No doubt the rest of Asao's week would be blissful. Marcus was always so sweet once he'd managed to get these moods out of his system. Antony couldn't indulge in thoughts of Marcus pampering his offering, though. It only made him long to pamper Hanyu in the same way, and that wasn't what was needed right now. He tried to make his gaze steady and hard as he turned it down on the young man still clinging to his legs. My attendant and I need to speak privately,